Mosman Council acknowledges the Borragiegal and Camaragal people as the traditional custodians of this land, and we pay our respects to elders of the past and present, and to those of the future, and acknowledge their spiritual connection to country. Good evening, everyone. I'm Therese from Mosman Library Service, and welcome to this author evening with Tania Blanchard, talking about her new novel, Echoes of War, which is published by Simon & Schuster. It's lovely to have you all online here tonight, and thank you to Tania for her time this evening. This talk is being recorded and will be available later on our website. A big thanks to my library colleague Kenny for doing all the Zoom admin for me tonight. There will be time for your questions toward the end, so please submit them via the chat function. On to our author. Tania Blanchard is a Sydney-based writer and is the author of 3 previous novels: The Girl from Munich, Suitcase of Dreams, Letters from Berlin. In her latest, Echoes of War, she takes the reader to Calabria, Italy, in 1936, right through to World War II. The main character, Giulia Tallariti, is a determined and talented young woman who dreams of having an ambitious and independent life away from the village, which is a place full of people she loves dearly. Thank you, Tania. We're looking forward to talking about your book this evening. I just want to ask you first, what drew you to write an historical novel set in the late 1930s with the spectre of World War II looming in Italy?
Hi, Therese. Thank you so much for having me this evening. Look, it was really interesting. I saw a photo on my father's fridge a few years ago. It's a photo I'd never seen before, black and white, and it was of a man in uniform. And he looked awfully like my father. And I thought it must be my grandfather. But from what I knew about my grandfather, he'd been exempt from war during World War II, so I'd been told. So obviously I approached my father and asked him about the photograph. And he explained that his father actually had fought with the Italian army in the wars with Abyssinia, which was Ethiopia, in the 1930s. And also in Albania in 1939 before World War II. And that really just sparked my interest. My grandfather was a very quiet man, and I just couldn't imagine what it might have been like for him to leave his tiny village, which was very remote in the south of Italy in Calabria, and go to exotic Africa, far away from home, and how that might have changed his perspective of life and how he viewed the world. And so I wanted to sort of explore what it might have been like for those people in those small communities that had left their countries or had contacted war for the very first time, and obviously then leading up to World War II, the big one, and how they viewed the war with the Allies and also Mussolini's regime. So, and that's what initially sparked my interest in that.
So a photograph instigated your whole, the whole start of writing this novel, the black and white photograph. Beautiful.
Sure was. Yeah.
The main character, Giulia, she's amazing, and she's a herbalist. What's the inspirational or reason behind her being a herbalist? And in the book you write, the greatest responsibility of all rested on the shoulders of women. We were the ones who kept the family together, kept our farms and businesses running. So Giulia is very strong in the village and in her family, but she's also, wants to have a trade as a herbalist. Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, sure. So the inspiration behind Giulia being a herbalist is that growing up, when we were at my grandparents' farm, they were on 10 acres outside of Sydney, on the outskirts of Sydney. They had a market garden, and I remember growing up playing games with my cousins where we'd pick herbs from the garden, and we'd pick sort of grasses and things like that, and pretend to make remedies and pretend to cook our dinners. So it's from this imagination, I realised that I must have heard something about my grandmother being a folk healer or a traditional healer. And I spoke to my father about this when I was looking at writing this story, and he said that she wasn't known as a healer as such, a folk healer, but she certainly did do a lot of traditional remedies Children would come to her with colic and she'd use herbs and olive oil. People would come to her for headaches and that sort of thing. And he described a technique that she used on people's backs called cupping, where a flame is in a glass or a cup, and then it's put onto somebody's back to help draw inflammation and phlegm and that sort of thing with respiratory conditions. So I knew that she was some type of healer. And it was fascinating that also I've had a lifelong fascination, I suppose, with herbal medicine. And I actually trained to become a herbalist myself many years ago. So all of this kind of crystallized together to create Julia's character and her love and desire to want to help people and heal people and become a herbalist, which was a really fascinating area to look into with the traditional herbal medicine and the traditional folk healing of Southern Calabria. It's really ancient, very, very long tradition. They use specific herbs and specific remedies. So it was just amazing to research further and then place Julia straight in the action.
In the book, her father, Andrea, was quite skeptical of her choosing being a herbalist as a profession.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. I guess he viewed what she was doing with the herbal medicine as a form of witchcraft. I guess the folk healing was the realm of women. That was women's power. Remedies often were passed from one family member down to another. So grandmother to granddaughter, mother to daughter, that sort of thing. And often they exchange all these recipes, which were just basically remedies, were handed down at Christmas time to the next member of the family. So it's certainly an area that women knew lots about, and men didn't sort of come into the equation quite as much. So it was their sense of power as women. And so, of course, someone like Andrea and a lot of the men wouldn't have understood what the women were doing and were worried that they were losing some of their male power to the women who were doing these particular remedies and looking after their community.
We're going to have the pleasure of hearing a short passage in a moment, but can you tell those of us who haven't read the novel how pivotal the role of women are in the village in this book, because it comes across very strongly?
Yeah, well, of course. And certainly you see that women are quite strong and powerful through the story, through the different characters. We've got Julia, of course, who wants to become a herbalist and flout the traditions of getting married young and having a family and living in the village forever. She wants to live this big life. And she's inspired, of course, by her nonna Mariana, who's the folk healer of the village. And she is a woman on her own. Her husband had died years ago. She has her own practice out of her house. And she sort of travels the district as well, healing people. And so that's quite an untraditional role for a woman. She's outside the box. So she's obviously a very strong woman that will forge her own path as well. And another person that influences Julia is Zia Francesca, who's her father's sister, whose husband also died some years before, and she now runs the trattoria, the restaurant in the village, all by herself and on her own. And she's quite headstrong like Julia, and she drives a red Fiat, and she has a little car and she does her thing. So Julia's really inspired by her Zia as well. And she also gets magazines from the north of the modern woman, and Julia's able to look through these magazines, and she wants a piece of this independence, this modern life that is so different to the very traditional values, a really ancient way of life in Calabria. So having said all that, then of course we have war that steps in, and more men are sent to war. And so the women are the ones left behind to have to continue running the farms, to run the businesses, to have the village life continue as it always has done, to deal with the bureaucrats. So women's strength is by bonding together, and the women have always known this. They've always known their strength, even though the men think they're the strong ones. But binding together during wartime, they can get so much done. And we see Julia's sister, Paula, who runs the farm while her father's away. Again, not a very traditional role for a young woman. And she works with the black market, and she thinks of ways to help the people in the community. So we really see this real strong sense of women binding together, women being the strength and the base of this community. They They look after the home, they look after the children, they heal the community, and they run everything else as well while the men are away.
Would you be able to read us the short passage that you mentioned before? Thank you.
Okay, so this is a passage I've picked that I thought might be interesting. It's set in 1943 when the Allies have already invaded southern Italy. And so the Allies are now on the mainland through Calabria, and the Germans have come down, of course, to fight against the Allies as well. So Julia is in her village with her family, and I'll just share this passage with you now. Okay. One morning, as I was collecting the yellow flowers of St. John's wort from the fields before breakfast, I heard a dog barking in the distance. Straightening up and stretching, I surveyed the landscape. Coming towards me along the road was a squad of about 10 soldiers. I squinted in the sunlight and felt sure they were not Italians. They weren't wearing the right uniform. I picked up my skirts and ran back into the village. "Soldiers are coming," I yelled. I went to the church and banged on the door of the priest's residence. "Padre, soldiers are coming," I repeated through gasping breaths as he opened the door and stared at me in astonishment. "They're just outside the village." "Are they Italian?" he asked. I shook my head. "No, but I don't know if they're Allies or Germans," he grunted. "Either way, the people of this town won't view them kindly." He thought for a moment. "I'll ring the bell. It's the only way to warn people in time. Knock on as many doors as you can and tell people to stay inside. With any luck, they're just passing through and won't trouble us at all." I nodded, dubious, but there was nothing else to do. I turned and began knocking on doors, encouraging others to help me warn the village as the bell started to toll. I made sure I warned Santoro and Teresa at the schoolmaster's house and Rosa at the general store before climbing a stone wall to see the soldiers' progress. I could see helmets at the end of the road. "May the Madonna protect us," I breathed and sprinted to Nonna's, but she was already outside her house. "Come on," I said, pulling her by the arm. "Let's go to Mama's. Soldiers are coming." We ran with the other villagers, some dragging pigs and sheep from their yards into their homes. I banged on Mama's door and she opened it quickly. "Come inside," she said, slamming the door behind us and bolting it firmly. We rushed to the shuttered windows and peered outside as men in uniform milled about the street. "They're German," whispered Nonna after we heard them speaking amongst themselves. They were thin, haggard and dirty, desperate men, and not at all like the tall, proud Germans we'd heard about. But desperate men were the most dangerous of all. I remembered what Stefano had written about the Nazis in Sicily, and I shuddered. What did they want here? "They're our allies," said Paola. "They might be, but I'm not letting them in here," said Mama. "I hope Antonio is safe in the mountains." We watched as they knocked on doors, but nobody answered, our knuckles white against the shutters as we waited to see what they would do. "I don't think they mean us harm," said Nonna. "Otherwise they would have already done it." "I'm not so sure," I whispered, more afraid now than I had been during the air raids. "I just wish they'd go away," muttered Mama. The soldiers climbed over fences and walked into gardens, picking ripe tomatoes and anything else they could get their hands on. They broke branches as they roughly pulled fruit from the trees. "The hide of them," said Paola. "They're stealing all we have. That produce has to last for months." She started for the door and I pulled her back, although I wanted more than anything to rush out and snatch the produce back. "No, Paola, you can't go out there. We don't know what they might do. They could attack us or shoot anyone who tries to stop them. It's not worth the risk." A squealing pig was dragged from its pen, the soldier jubilant at his find. I was appalled by the theft in broad daylight, but then I noticed how frail he was, his uniform hanging off him. And when I looked at the others on the street, I wondered how long since they'd eaten a decent meal. "I think they're hungry," I whispered in surprise. "I don't care if they're hungry," said Mama, although she was trembling with fear. "They can pay for what they're taking like anyone else would." Every theft was a blow to our community, but nobody came out to confront the soldiers, Instead, we watched silently from our windows. Yes, but like Julia pointed out, they still had guns on them, said Paula. Well, we'd rather go hungry than be shot or have our daughters raped, said Nonna grimly. Other soldiers followed his lead, and chickens were taken from their coops along with the eggs and our milking cow. Not Bella, cried Mama. We've had her for so long. She's part of the family. Shh, it's all right, I whispered. Paula can find us another milking cow, can't you? You know I will, she said confidently. But I wondered how scarce livestock was going to be if Germans were scouring the countryside like this. Where do you think they're going? Asked Mama, peering through the window. Away from here, hissed Nonna. I think they're headed to Reggio and the west coast to stop the Allies when they crossed to the mainland, I said. But maybe they got separated from the rest of their unit, got lost in the mountains and ended up here. Suddenly, one of the men kicked in a door across the street and 4 men followed him out inside. Oh dear, said Mama, her eyes wide with shock. We could only watch helplessly, not knowing what was happening inside the house of our neighbour, Signora Romeo. At least there were no young men or women there, just a wizened old lady. The door opened and the men walked out again with bottles of olive oil, jars of olives, wheels of cheese and strings of dried mushrooms. We have to do something, said Paula. If they raid every home like this, we'll have nothing left and we'll all starve. Or whatever else she was going to say was cut off by the little old lady stepping outside of her door and waving the men goodbye. She's done it to save the rest of us, said Mama slowly, moving her hands in the sign of the cross as the men disappeared down the street, carrying their finds and leading their stolen animals to the other end of town without touching another home. Thank God for Signora Romeo, said Nonna. What about our sheep? Said Paula in consternation. Surely they have enough now. I guess we'll have to wait and see, I said. It could have been so much worse, said Mama, mopping her brow with her handkerchief. After a while, when we'd seen no more soldiers, we felt game enough to go out onto the street. Signora Romeo greeted us. I have to thank you, she said as she shuffled towards us. Without your warning, I would have had my best produce out for them to find. Whatever happened? Asked Mama. One spoke a little Italian, and somehow I managed to get him to believe that my preserves and oils are the best in the village and everyone else's is poor quality. Why would they believe that? Paula asked. Because I told them I'm a strega and that I cursed everyone's olive oil this year, so mine would be the best. Then I waved around an old amulet I had and mumbled some words in front of them, telling them that bad things would happen to them if they took any more from the village. She shrugged. I thought it was best if they just were gone. Asking them to put anything back was asking for more trouble. I told them they could stay a little longer, that I'd enjoy the company of young men like themselves, but unfortunately they decided to leave. She began to cackle uproariously, slapping her hand against her black skirt. Mama grasped her by the shoulders and kissed her downy cheeks. You could have been killed, but you saved the village. You saved us all. It was nothing, she said, but she beamed with pleasure. There you go.
Thank you so much. You should read the audio book, Tania. That was wonderful.
Oh, I don't know about that.
So that leads me to my question about the way you create drama without it being melodramatic, which was illustrated in that passage, but also at another time in the book, or I won't give a spoiler away, my heart was in my mouth for Julia reading when there's a certain scene with a tidal wave approaching. Yep. So how do you manage to write so intensely without being melodramatic?
I guess the most important thing for me is authenticity. So with the tidal wave scene, for example, I did lots of research, watched documentaries about the tsunamis around the world, about the effects that they have. I read firsthand accounts of people in those kind of situations. And more specifically, I went back to the 1908 earthquake that hit Calabria and Sicily. And after this massive earthquake, I think it was about 8 on the Richter scale or something like that, there was this tsunami that broke across Messina in Sicily and Reggio in Calabria and those coasts and devastated so much of those communities. And that's what inspired me actually to write this scene with the tidal wave, because I wanted to illustrate the incredible volatile geology of the region through Calabria and how people had to live with this on an everyday basis. And that I suppose provided part of the way I could write Julia's character through this scene, is that they've seen all sorts of manner of destruction, volcanoes, earthquakes, tidal waves, floods, you name it. So they were quite matter of fact about these things happening, and then they knew exactly what they had to do. They were very resilient, and they'd move forward with the cleanup and dealing with the situation. So there was that, I suppose. So I wanted to remain authentic to what the event might be like, and also to how the people's reactions might be like. And reading some of those first-hand accounts, I guess, were really helpful. Then all I could really do is just put myself into Julia's shoes and imagine what it might have felt like, and really try to dig deep to find the right emotions. I guess that's quite important to me, that I use authentic and real raw emotions in the story, and not just skim across the top, which is sometimes easier to do. So it took probably a few goes to get that scene actually right, to really get that heart-stopping fear and the disbelief and bewilderment and the shock that she would have experienced watching this unfold, and similar with the Nazi coming through the village. And interestingly, I just might like to also add, I forgot to mention before, that scene was actually based on a story that my father told me, that his mother had told him about, that she witnessed during the war, about the soldiers coming in through the village. So that was another layer, I suppose, on top to provide an authentic scene.
There's a rich family thread through this novel then.
Yeah. It's been wonderful.
So it's written in the first person, and I'm wondering, it could be a long shot, is it to reflect Julia's strength and determination, which to me comes across as a reader more powerfully when something's written in the first person than the third?
Yeah, most definitely. It's something I discovered when I was writing my first book, The Girl from Munich. I had sort of played with other writing styles before, writing from the third person. But when I started writing The Girl from Munich, it just somehow flowed so much better when I wrote in the first person. I could put myself into the main character's shoes and write from a more personal point of view, I suppose. And I guess that felt more powerful to me, and felt more authentic in some ways. And I could really tap into those deep emotions as well. So that's something I've obviously carried through with each of my novels, and I sort of just slip into the story, into the character a lot better when I go from first person.
Now, you have visited Italy when you were a teenager, and COVID put a halt to your plans to visit there. Yep. To do presumably some work on this novel.
Yes.
Can you share with us how you brought a bit of Calabria to Sydney in order to help write the book?
Yeah, well, I guess the first thing I did after I could put aside the disappointment was I got on, the computer, looked at YouTube and some fantastic videos of people in the small remote communities in southern Italy, in Calabria particularly. And there were these fantastic videos of the mountains. They were rugged and just not a lot on them. And there were these villages right perched on the very tops of these high peaks, which just amazed me that they were still standing. And then there were these fantastic videos of people doing some wonderful dancing, some tarantella dancing. And that just got me straight back into what southern Italy and Calabria is all about. Obviously, I did some research online as well as some cultural sites, looking at some fantastic photos of all the cultural parts of Italy, of Calabria particularly, but also looking at the landscapes. But also another thing that was wonderful was that my father and aunt had been to Italy the year before and had spent some time in Calabria. My aunt wanted to go to the Festa of the Madonna. It's a festival of the Madonna that happens every year. And these festivals are quite a big cultural part of Italian life. And particularly in the south of Italy, in Calabria, the Madonna is really revered. So she wanted to go to the local village festa. So that was amazing that my father and aunt could tell me all about this wonderful festival and how this church was perched in the middle of nowhere between two towns, and that they, they had this caravan where they pick up the Madonna, the statue, and they travel in caravan form with processions of people behind them singing and dancing to the church. So that was another great way to get into the sense of what Calabria is all about. And certainly I talk about these festivals in the novel. And the best way, of course, of all was talking to family and friends. Often they were people that I hadn't seen for quite some time. And so reconnecting with my family and the Calabrian culture, eating lots of fantastic Italian food. I got to experience salami making and actually got my hands in there and tried to do some of it, but I was hopeless compared to the friends that were showing me who'd been doing it for years and years. But it was a really wonderful experience, and we got to take away the salami and we're still enjoying it. It's just wonderful. And then I actually spoke to my aunt and my dad a bit more about some of their family stories, and tried some of my aunt's recipes as well that she's kept on from her mother. So I would make, I was trying to think of a biscotti, and I made some zipoli and some different Italian or particularly Calabrian recipes. And that sort of got me back into the mood of what Calabria is all about, and reminded me of some of the memories that I'd forgotten I had of when I was a child and watched my grandmother cooking and all the aunts around the kitchen stove, doing all sorts of things in the kitchen, cooking up a big feast for the family to come and sit down at the table. And there'd be 20 or 30 of us around these tables every week, having these fantastic meals. So they were all great ways to get into the sense of what Calabria is all about. I was very, very fortunate to be able to tap into that all right here.
And who was your trusted reader to read, the manuscript of your book before you sent it to the publisher?
Well, I did give my novel to my daughter to read, and she read some of it for me, which was great. And she gave me some great feedback. So she's nearly 20 now. So I really valued her feedback, some things that didn't quite make sense or that she thought would be worked better. So she was great. But the other person, of course, was my aunt, the one that had been to Italy a couple of years ago. So she read some of the passages as well in the story. And I really wanted to see whether she got that sense of authenticity in the story, and whether she loved the character of Julia, who, of course, is kind of based around my grandmother to some degree. And I was very pleased when she said that she loved it. Thank goodness. I don't know what I would have done otherwise. So I was very lucky to have those influences.
Do you feel in the future you might write another novel set in Calabria or some other part of Italy?
Yeah, look, I think I will, purely because I don't think I'm finished with Calabria, and I don't think Calabria is finished with me. I'd really love to get back there one day and explore the landscapes, explore the culture, get back in touch with family members that are still there and hear some of their stories about their family members, about stories that have been brought down through the generations too. So I don't know that whether it'll be a story set sort of more recently or maybe further back into family stories in the past. But yeah, I definitely think that there'll be another Calabrian story coming up sometime down the track.
So Tania, when you're not writing these amazing historical novels, what do you like to read, or who are your favourite authors?
Well, I guess I like to specifically read fantasy and historical fiction. I guess they're my two favourite genres. That's what I've always loved to read. I also like to read some good thrillers too. So from a historical novel point of view, earlier this year, sorry, I've just got a dog barking in the background there. A fantasy book that I actually finished reading earlier in the year was Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials. Yeah. And I know that's quite different to the historical novels that I write. It's more young adult, but I was absolutely fascinated with his large fantasy world to rival, the Lord of the Rings, really. It was beautifully written, and I really enjoyed that. I guess other fantasy, I like George R.R. Martin, of course, The Game of Thrones. I mean, who could miss that? That was amazing. But something I'm really interested, I've noticed on telly recently that they've shown a new movie coming out, or a new series on Dune by Frank Herbert. I haven't read that for years and years, but I absolutely loved that series of books back in the day. Another great big epic world. Look, I think at the end of the day, it comes down to the fact I love big epic stories. And same with the historical fiction. You've got Ken Follett and his Pillars of the Earth, and I'm yet to read the prequel to that. Hopefully I'll do that pretty soon. Diana Gabaldon, I love her Outlander series. That's just gorgeous. Lots of sensory scenes and lots of historical detail, really beautifully written. And I love Jamie Fraser. He's such a great character, as is Claire. And the thrillers, I guess, look, Tom Clancy, of course, I love to read. And Ken Follett used to write thrillers as well once upon a time, which was interesting. So yeah, lots of good stuff there. But yeah, I'm in between books at the moment and waiting for my next good read.
Excellent. So Tania, what would you like our audience to take away from your book this evening?
Look, I think the biggest thing is what I found fascinating and what I learned during my journey of research and writing Echoes of War. And I guess predominantly was the fact that I knew very little about Italy's stance during World War II. I had no idea that there were so many wars leading up to World War II that Mussolini had placed Italy into. I didn't know much about Italy and Mussolini and the fascist regime and how he was aligned with Hitler and how they entered World War II. And what I found really fascinating too was the fact that when the Allies invaded in 1943, it split the country into two. So it was the fascist North against the Allied occupied South, and really created like a civil war. And I didn't know anything about that role that Italy played in this war. So I guess that's probably one thing on a historical point of view. I guess the other thing was the amazing culture and landscapes of Calabria. It's a really, really ancient part of the world. It was colonized like in about 8 BC by the ancient Greeks originally. So very, very ancient, and lots of Greek traditions still come through in the culture today, which is really fascinating. And it was occupied by big civilizations, the ancient Rome, you had the Normans, you had the Byzantines, you had the Ottomans. So it's a melting pot, basically, I suppose, of cultural influences that has created the amazing food and culture and music and the vibrant people of Calabria that you see today. So I think at the end of the day, it's a story about a region that perhaps a lot of people don't know about, and viewing World War II through Italian eyes, something that I think not a lot of people have seen either. There's a lot from the Allied point of view, and some also now from the German point of view. But I don't think there are many stories out there from the Italian point of view and how they viewed World War II. So I guess, some of the things I'd like people to take away, and the fact that it's a story about strong women. And there are always strong women in the world. We just don't get enough recognition for those stories. And now that's starting to happen, which is lovely.
Yeah, I think that's probably what I enjoyed as well, learning about Italy and the war, because I knew nothing about that either. Yeah. So we're just about to open up the chat. So think of your questions and send them through. What is the next book of yours I should read, Tania, now that I've read Echoes of War? They're lined up behind you. Yeah.
Yes, well, I have all of my books here. So we have The Girl from Munich, which was my very first book. And that's set in Germany during World War II and follows my grandmother's story growing up. And then Suitcase of Dreams is the next one to it there, which follows my grandmother's story, basically migrating to Australia and becoming New Australians in the 50s. And that's basically her story. Letters from Berlin goes back to Germany during World War II and follows a mixed family. So mixed Jewish and German family, and their story of wartime in Germany and how they were affected by the Nazi regime. So that's a really fascinating story too, which is also based on one of my grandmother's cousin's story. And then, of course, we've got Echoes Before, and I'm writing a new book at the moment too, which is completely different. I'm delving into my husband's family's stories now, and his father's side of the family comes from England. So this story is based in Durham, which is in the north of England, around the turn of the 20th century, so the late Victorian era. And it follows a young woman who is a school teacher and also is involved in running a country pub. So a really, really interesting story there.
That sounds wonderful. Looking forward to that.
Thanks.
Tania, we've got a comment from Sue. She says, I've read your other books and I've just started your new book. Was fascinated to see this book is based in Italy. I love your work.
Thank you so much, Sue. Thanks. Thank you.
Has anyone else got some questions?
Tania, I'm so happy for you, my friend. Beautiful.
Thank you so very, very much.
Love it.
Really appreciate it.
Magda has asked Tania, how long does your research take and how do you write at the same time, or do you write at the same time, or just do the research?
Yeah, look, first up, I come up with a story idea, and then there's a lot of research that obviously goes into the family stories. We're looking behind the family stories and also the historical events that are happening at that time. So the research, I guess, probably I would work on for about 3 or 4 months solidly, and also doing bits and pieces for another few months before I actually start writing. And then during the writing process, there's always times I have to go back to research. It's like, I don't know, how did the Allies cross from Sicily to Calabria during the war? What did they, what transport did they use, or what routes did they use traveling up to the mainland? Just little things like that I may not have the great detail that I need to write in the story. So often there's lots and lots of research that goes into writing either a really short scene or just a few sentences, but you need to have that understanding to actually write the scene authentically, and historical detail and accuracy is really important to me. So I need to make sure I have that there.
Thank you. Does anyone want to place a question in the chat or unmute yourself and ask Tania a question? I think I read somewhere, Tania, that, you wrote this mostly in lockdown. Did you have a time frame you had to write it in? Was it a bit?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. As you know, Letters from Berlin was published last year. So essentially it was a tight turnaround, I suppose, to get Echoes of War out this year. So it essentially, I guess, was written in just over a year, I suppose. So it was a bit tight. During lockdown, really interesting having everyone under one roof. Luckily for me, I was able to hang on to my office. So I had my quiet space and serenity that I could concentrate and write. And like any time that I have to reach a deadline, I suppose I try and write to a word count at the end of each week. So I make sure I write a certain number of words and move forward in the manuscript so it actually gets finished, and then go back and review and edit as I can. And thank God I've got a wonderful team of editors at the publishing house, Simon & Schuster, and they're absolutely delightful in helping me bring it all together and sculpt and sort of pull pieces out and that sort of thing, just to make it more pacey and to get it just where it needs to be.
Excellent. Annabelle has asked, you've written 4 books now. Which heroine was your favourite to write and why?
Oh, that's such a good question. Oh, wow. Look, I love each of my heroines in their own special way. They've been each really amazing to write. Each story's been quite different. Look, I think I have to say Lottie, especially in The Girl from Munich. It was my very first book. It was the story that got me published, and it's basically my grandmother's story, and she only died in 2015, so I was really close to her And she told me lots of stories growing up about her life in Germany and here in Australia. And so her stories were really, really close to me, I suppose. So writing Lottie and remaining true to my grandmother's spirit and her larger than life persona, I guess Lottie's got to be my favourite heroine.
Does anyone else have a question for Tania?
I don't have a question. I just want.
Hello, Renata.
I'm very happy to have the chance to join that Zoom meeting from Germany and to listen to Tania. And I have so far no chance to get the book. It's difficult because of Corona, but I think Girl of Munich was the first book I read. I bought it when we were in Australia, and I think that's a great story. But my favorite is Suitcase of Dreams because it tells me more about what happens to migrants. And I think that's one of your subjects, that people are migrating, your whole family is getting to Australia from Europe mostly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Thank you so much, Renata. I really appreciate that. And yeah, look, I think Suitcase of Dreams is a great story, and there are so many wonderful migration stories here in Australia that we're yet to tap into. So I certainly think that there'll be other migration stories happening at some point in time too. Whether it's my Italian family, my German family, I don't know. There's lots of stories to be told, but I see why the migration story holds a special place in your heart. And I hope that you get Echoes of War very soon. We'll have to make sure that you get it. And thank you for joining us too. I really appreciate that. It's lovely to see you and hear you all the way from Germany tonight.
Yeah, well, you're welcome.
Tania, Annabelle asks, you always write such wonderful romances full of heart and totally believable. How do you manage the balance?
Oh gosh. I think, again, I have to keep coming back to saying authenticity. It's got to mirror true life, I think. It's got to mirror the ups and downs that ordinary people experience every day. And I guess that's what I love about writing these books, is that they're stories about ordinary people like any of us who go through extraordinary experiences set against like these major historical events. And look, romance can be a real coming of age, and it is for a lot of the women in these stories. They are of that age where they're learning about romance and love and the way forward for their adult selves. So yeah, I think it's just trying to put myself in their shoes and imagine what life might be like at that time, and what real life is all about, and real emotion too. I think it's important, like I mentioned before, for me to stick to the raw, true emotions, and sometimes they're not so easy to write or to read about or to think about even, or to feel even, but I think it's really important to remain true to your story and to your character's arc.
Thank you. Sue just comments, many thanks for the opportunity to hear about the book. She just had to leave the session. Anne is saying to you, love all your books, Tania, real life and adventures. And this
Thank you.
Anne
thanks,
from
Anne.
Dubbo. Yep.
Oh, thanks, Anne.
Okay, does anyone have any other comments or questions for Tania? Doesn't seem like it. Look, I want to thank you, Tania, for a really wonderful novel. As I mentioned to you before, really transported me straight to Italy. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Oh,
thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm looking forward to recommending it to our library customers as well.
Thank you.
As will our Shorelink librarians. This was a Shorelink event with Lane Cove, Stanton and Mosman Library. It's available to buy at any of your bookshops, but our Shorelink libraries use Constant Reader or Burns Bay Bookery, and I'm looking forward to reading your other novels.
Thanks so much, Therese. And yeah, I recommend everyone just get out there and use your wonderful library services, especially in these last weeks of restrictions. They can do they have some wonderful services, and we're really lucky to have them.
I think we've got a hand up from Wendy. Wendy, did you want to say something? Do you want to unmute, Wendy?
No, I was just applauding.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. We appreciate
Thanks, Wendy.
that. Okay, so thank you again, Tania, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much, Therese, and thanks, Shorelink Libraries.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Stay safe.